All right, let me get started with this thing. We can talk about chapter 8. Is this thing showing? I freaking hope so. Okay. So we had our meeting this morning. We talked about going over, continue with video lectures, but then doing math in our collaborate sessions going forward. And I think that's a great idea. So I'm going to just cover the material in chapter 8. There's not a whole lot of new stuff here. Well, there's some new stuff, but it's not a big chapter overall. So hopefully this won't be too bad. Chapter 8 is about exposure technique selection. So we built on what we learned in chapter 6 about the technical factors, what they affect in the tube, and then what they are going to ultimately do with our image. And then we're going to talk about in chapter 8 how to know what to select based on what you're doing. We're going to talk about, well, I'll tell you what we're going to talk about in a minute because I'm going to go through these objectives. And then in chapter 9, we're going to put all that crap together and do a lot of problems about selecting optimal techniques, basically. There's a lot of different ways to do things that will still work out, but there is always a best way to do it when you take into account your risk, your benefit, patient dose, your image quality, all that jazz. And that's what we're going to plan to do with chapter 9. So for chapter 8, we have objectives. We're going to learn the purpose of AEC systems. You guys have probably touched on those a little bit with Mrs. Garner in RAD 110, and we haven't talked about them much in RAD 121 yet, but this is the chapter in which we learn about those. We're going to differentiate among different types of radiation detectors used in AEC. There are 2 main types. One of them we still use and one we don't use anymore. So those would be important things to know going forward. Recognizing how the detector size and configuration affects the response of the AEC device. So you can learn a little bit about that. Explain how alignment and positioning affect the response of the AEC device. Just like everything else, if you don't have it done right, you'll probably get an image, but it may or may not be right. Discuss patient and exposure technique factors and their effects on the response of the AEC device. Analyze unacceptable images produced by AEC and identify possible causes. I will tell you that 99% of AEC errors come from not having the anatomy properly centered over your AEC. We'll talk about that in a minute. We're going to describe patient radiation protection issues that are associated with AEC. And then state the importance of calibration of the AEC system to the type of image receptor used. I think that's it for objectives. Lots of objectives. Okay. Automatic exposure control. I keep saying AEC, and you guys have probably heard AEC at clinical, but you may or may not realize exactly what that means. What that means is an automatic exposure control system. It is a system that is set up to make sure that your radiation, the radiation used for producing images is consistent. What happens is there's a detector. We'll talk about exactly what kind and how they work and stuff in just a second. But there's a detector, and it measures how much radiation is transmitted through the patient and reaches the detector. And once it gets as much radiation to the detector as it needs, it's going to stop the exposure. You don't have to know this just yet. You will later. But basically what it does is it opens the circuit. I don't know if you guys talk about circuits much with Dr. Morse in physics class, but you know that electricity can't flow in an open circuit. And what it does, your AEC system is connected to your the filament and the KVP setting in your X-ray generator. So what happens is when you get enough radiation to the AEC detector, the detector sends a signal that says, hey, we don't need this anymore. That opens the circuit, and it takes that pushing power from the KVP away. So there's no electrons getting pushed to the other side of the X-ray tube anymore. If there's no electrons going to the other side of the X-ray tube, then there's no X-rays being produced. So that's what's happening on the back side of AEC. But on the front end, it's basically just we need 1 million photons to make an X-ray happen, an X-ray image happen. We get 1 million photons, okay, we're done. Stop this exposure. It's a set exposure, a set level of exposure. And once it is reached, it terminates what it's doing. There are 2 types of AEC systems. There are phototimers and ionization chambers. I'm going to talk about phototimers first. I think that's the order your book goes in. I don't remember. Yes, it does. Okay, I just had to check and look. So phototiming, some of you may have heard that said at clinical. They might say, are you going to phototime it or are you going to straight time it? Or something to that effect. Phototiming is what we used to use. We do not currently use phototimer systems anymore in radiography. So there's a term, what do they call it? They call it a legacy term, that people still say phototimer, but it's not actually a phototimer. Just like, you know, some of us will call it a cassette instead of an IR. It's not truly a film cassette, but that's just what we call everything because that's the terminology that it used to be. But phototimers are a type of radiation detector that is placed behind the image receptor. So it's underneath the bucky, and it's coated with a fluorescent material. Remember from your Unit 1 that X-rays can cause certain materials to fluoresce or give off light. This is where we use that characteristic of X-rays. So the light paddles are coated with fluorescent material. They get enough X-ray. The X-ray makes the paddles glow, producing the light. And then once there's enough light, then that turns into an electrical signal, which trips the timer and tells it to stop. Recall that whenever, try to think back to the last time that you took an X-ray using AEC, like a chest X-ray or maybe an abdomen or something like that. When you look at the control panel, there's a set KVP and there's a set MA, but everything that we're varying with AEC is the time. So there's a set MA, like it might come up at 400 MA for everything. But then your time is what the AEC is controlling. Everything is about the timer. So we'll talk about that in a minute and implications of that. Okay, so before I move on to this ionization chamber, recall that the phototimer is the one that used to be used and is not used anymore. And it is placed behind the image receptor in your bucky system. Okay, now ionization chambers. These are the kind that we do still use. An ionization chamber, think about the words ion, means that it's going to create electrons. And that flow of electrons is going to do something in a minute. It's just what it sounds like. It's a hollow cell of air that has something in it that gets excited whenever the radiation interacts with it. Whenever it gets excited, it ionizes, so it gives off electrons. When the electrons flow, we have an electrical current. That current travels along a wire where it tells the circuit to open up and it stops the exposure. So there's more steps in the phototimer system, but with ionization chambers, it's a simpler process. You might think that we would want to use the most intricate, most accurate system, but we don't. Ion chambers are less sophisticated, they're less accurate, but that also means that they're less prone to having problems. They're less prone to breaking down and causing problems. So phototimer is more accurate, but it's also more intricate, so it's more likely to break. When I think about stuff like this, I always think about my country grandma. Grandma Joyce got a Cadillac, I don't know, a bunch of years ago. I was little. And it had so many switches and like power seats and all this stuff that like people didn't automatically have back then. And I was like, Grandma, look at all these switches. And she was not impressed. She was like, this is just more stuff to break. This looks like more things that I'll have to pay to fix later. And every time I think about photo timers and ionization chambers, I think about my grandma and that blue Cadillac that she had that I thought was the coolest, nicest car. And she was just like, meh, it's whatevs. Grandma's blue Cadillac is like a photo timer. It's fancy, but it's more likely to break, and it's not something that you want to have breaking on the regular. Cadillacs and x-ray equipment probably cost about the same amount of money to fix every time anything breaks. Okay, this slide is showing from page 211 in your textbook the difference in the setup of the photo timer versus the ionization chamber. Again, photo timer we don't use anymore. Light paddles are behind the image receptor. Ionization chamber is what we still use. And in that setup, you have your chamber in front of your image receptor. Also, I want to keep in mind that both of these pictures are showing your patient laying on a table, but it is the same setup as if they were standing up at a wall bucky. It's the same thing. I think, hold on. Oh God, I thought I was going to be so fast, but I'm not so fast. Is there not? Backup time density. I don't know. I'm just going to roll with it. All right. What I was saying about the picture in your book that shows the placement of the light paddle versus the ionization chamber, it shows it as the patient is laying down. It still is the same for if the patient is standing up. Vice versa. You guys are familiar with what this thing looks like, the wall bucky, and how you can see those chambers, the 3 chambers in the middle. Those are showing you where the ionization chambers are located. So if you select center cell, like you're doing a lateral chest x-ray, only that guy in the middle of the bucky is the detector that's going to be in use for this exposure. When you do a PA chest, if you've either got the outer cells or all 3 cells, depending on where you're working at, those are what are going to pick up your radiation and determine when to stop the exposure. Most all systems have 3 sets of detectors. I think Philips equipment has 5, so it's more like an X configuration there on the bucky. But I also want to point out that these detectors are in the same place when you're dealing with the table bucky also. They're just not marked on the tabletop because your tabletop can move and the detectors are fixed with the bucky. So I've had students before who have been confused by that because they can't see the detectors outlined on a table bucky like they can on the wall bucky. They don't realize that they're still there. They're still there, but they are attached to the bucky itself, and that's why you can't see them, or you can't. They can't be written or outlined on the tabletop because the tabletop can move, but the bucky doesn't. So you basically want to select which detectors are going to be over your anatomy of interest, and it's very important that you do that. I don't know if you guys have done it yet, but if you're trying to do like my examples of a chest x-ray, if you're trying to do a PA chest and you accidentally select the inner cell, you're going to have overexposure because that detector is trying to get radiation through your spine, your heart, your aorta, a lot of stuff there that is thicker and denser than what the anatomy of your chest, like your lungs themselves, look like. So that's why you're doing outer cells when you do a PA chest. if you could imagine a person right here at this bucky, and you think about where the lungs are, they're more out to the sides, right? So that's why we want to use outer cells when we do a PA. Now on the flip side, when we turn them to the side and we're doing a lateral, not everyone's body even covers those two outer cells when you do a lateral chest x-ray. And also when you think about a lateral chest x-ray, what you're worried about mostly is that hilar region, which is right in the middle. And if you have them properly positioned, that should be over that center cell. So you have to determine what you're trying to look at and select the correct cells for that. Say for about 80-something% of our exams, you're pretty much just going to select center cell, because what does your Merrill's textbook tell you? It tells you to center to the anatomy, right? If you've got the central ray to the anatomy and you've got that in the center of your IR, then you can use center cell for pretty much everything. Your textbook outlines some specific features of AEC systems. This MAS readout, I feel like, is probably the most important and most used in practice. If any of you have been with me in clinical in the past, I try to always point this feature out to you. So recall that I told you that your KVP and your MA are always set for AEC exams, but the time is what is varied. And since the time can be varied, after you make your exposure, there's a place where it pops up what the actual exposure was. So if you've got your PHS, you've got it set at 125 kVp, say you've got 400 MA. Whenever you make your exposure and your ionization chamber gets a sufficient amount of radiation, it terminates the exposure. On your screen, it will pop up and let you know that it only used 2.15 MAS, let's just say. I don't know. I just pulled that out of the air. But if it used 2.15 MAS, and we know that the MA was set at 400, we could math that and figure out how fast that exposure was. I'm not doing that right here, right now, but just know that it's a thing. I like to do that. I like to use my MAS readout if I'm going to be setting techniques for some things. An example of this, I might use an AEC system to set my AP for my lumbar spine, because pretty much anybody, as long as they don't have some crazy deformed anatomy, you know where an AP lumbar spine, where the spine is, right? Even with a lot of fluff and stuff, and you can't feel their bony anatomy, you can find the center of somebody pretty okay. So I might use AEC to shoot that. And then I see that it comes up that it says I used 85 kVp and I used 80 MAS. Let's say it's a big person, 85 kVp, 80 MAS. I can use that information when I go to turn them to do their obliques, and know that if it shoots out, if my AEC shoots out and says I used 85 kVp at 20 MAS, I know I did something wrong, because nobody is that much thinner when you rotate them up to the side, right? Or you can use that technique that shot out for the AP and estimate what the technique might be for an oblique. So I used 85 kVp at 80 for an AP. I know it needs to be a little bit more when I oblique them, because they're going to be a little bit thicker. So let's say that I set my technique for my oblique instead of using AEC, so that I have that wiggle room with my centering. And I decide to use 85 kVp and 120 MAS. I know that sounds like a lot, but recall that you have to make a change of at least 50% with your MAS to make a difference in your image. So if you're dealing with 80 MAS, then you need to go up quite a bit. Going from 80 to 85, you're basically not doing anything except for just giving them radiation twice for no reason. So you don't want to do that. So that's what your MAS readout is. Make sure you know where it is on control panels whenever you're at clinical, especially at sites that use AEC. Talked about that a lot. Minimum response time. Your minimum response time is basically the shortest time that the X-ray equipment can possibly make an exposure. For most equipment, I believe that your minimum response time is like 1 millisecond. I don't remember for sure. I feel pretty confident that it's 1 millisecond, which is 1/1000th of a second. Pretty sure that's what it is. Our equipment now is a lot faster than what it used to be, and our timers are more accurate than what they used to be. So that's pretty fast. But this is just something to keep in mind if you were doing, like, we've been talking about chest x-ray, so let's stick with that. Let's say you were doing a chest x-ray, you had 120 kVp, and you set 1,000 MAS. 1,000 MA as your time, and you have a very thin person. They might require less than 1 MA and more than 1 MAS. Less than 1 MAS. So, that being said, if your exposure time needs to be less than 1 millisecond, it's not going to happen. You're going to end up overexposing that person. So you may have to bring your MA down to bring your time up if you're going to be close to minimum response time. There is a thing called reciprocity law, which we have talked about, but I haven't used those words, where you can use, say, 200 MAS for 2 seconds. Dang it, 200 MA for 2 seconds will get you 400 MAS, where 400 MA for 1 second will also get you 400 MAS. That's called the reciprocity law. Whatever mix of MAs and times that equals the same MAS is equal. They're all equal to each other. However, there is a time that reciprocity law can fail, and that is when you are approaching minimum response time, or MRT. If you're getting to such a short exposure time like that, reciprocity law may not hold up, and you may have a problem with your exposure. So just know that that's a thing. There are also backup timers on your AEC system. Your textbook, I think, talks about, I can't remember if it's in this textbook or in the Bush Hong textbook, it talks about setting a backup time of about 150% of what you expect the time to be. So this is the maximum amount of time that X-ray exposures can take, but you want to set like kind of like a safety net, where if you have the wrong thing selected, or if you have like your selected wall bucky and it's supposed to be table bucky, for example, or something to that effect. If you've got something like that going on, you want to have a fail-safe system to where you can Mia, why? Nana. I see you, baby. Love you, Nana. Can you close the door, please? Are you recording? Yes. All right, AEC time systems also have a feature called backup time. Backup time is like a safety net. It's something that keeps your exposure from just going on and on and on and on indefinitely. Your textbook talks about setting a backup time that is approximately 150 to 200% of the expected exposure time. So from our example of doing like a lumbar spine, if you're doing a lumbar spine and you don't want to make it to, this is hard to explain, you want to set it in such a way that if you thought that the person's exposure was going to be 80 MAS, let's say it's a big person, we expect it to be 80 MAS. We want to set it to where between, what's 150% of that? Why am I picking these numbers out of air? 120 MAS or 160 MAS is our backup. That once that exposure is reached, the equipment will go ahead and stop the exposure anyways. This is a fail-safe system for, basically, I always think of backup time as coming in handy when you are trying to penetrate something that's not going to get penetrated. Let's say you're trying to do a hip and you're trying to use AEC and you didn't know they had a hip replacement. It's going to burn up all the tissue around it. That's not necessary. Or in the instance where we've probably all done it, I know I have a bunch of times, where you accidentally select the wall bucky and it's supposed to be table bucky, or something like that. And if the wall bucky is sitting there waiting to get the appropriate amount of radiation, but the tube is over the table and the patient's on the table, it's never going to happen. So you're just going to be sitting there making exposure, and it's not going to cut off. And the backup time stops that from happening. The last thing that I have under our AEC system features are density controls. Your density control allows you to select that amount of radiation that's going to get to the detector before it stops the timer. Most of the time you guys are just going to leave that alone, and not all systems now have the option for you guys to change this. It usually looks like a square that's been cut in half diagonally, and half of the square is white and half of it is black. That's what your density selection control looks like, and you can increase or decrease how much radiation is going to get to the detector. So if the machine is calibrated in such a way that it says, I need 1 million X-ray photons and then I'm going to cut this exposure off. When you change the density control, you're telling it, hey, listen, man, instead of only taking 1 million, we need you to take 1.5 million before you stop this exposure. We need you to allow it to get a little bit more cooked than it would have before. Or on the flip side, I use the density control when I do chest x-rays on pediatric patients. I don't use the outer cells because a lot of times their chests don't reach the outer cells. So I'll use the center cell, but I'll use like a -2 density. And what that does is that tells the detector, hey, don't get as much radiation as you normally would. When you get like 3/4 of what you need or whatever, shut this thing off, because otherwise it's going to burn out the anatomy of interest. So you can make selections on that also. Okay. I have seen systems that go as high or low as a plus or -6, but then the textbook, it talks about going from like a minus to a +2. So you have a little bit of leeway with that. I touched on earlier the fact that you need to have things properly aligned or you're going to have issues. Just like you also need to have the appropriate detector selected, or you're going to have issues. You want to have your area of interest match what your detector selection looks like. If the anatomy doesn't fully cover the detector, that can be a problem. I don't know if Mrs. Garner talked to you guys about that when you learned about positioning for a clavicle exam, but think about your clavicle. It's not thicker than not a lot thicker anyways, than like your finger. So that's not going to cover the detector. So what happens in that situation, you would never want to use an AEC system for like a clavicle. I'm sure you've seen people do it, but it's not the best way to do it. You would want to select your center cell when you're going to do a clavicle, and you would want to put that part over it. Well, think about it common sense wise. You guys have seen those on the wall bucky. How big is that cell? And it's oriented lengthwise, and the clavicle goes across, and most people don't have much tissue above their clavicle. So if you were to try to use AEC, what's going to happen is you're going to have your beam over that part, over that detector. It's going to get some radiation. actually it's going to get more radiation faster than what it needs to, because it's going to pick up all that dead area where there's not tissue, and it's going to stop your exposure too soon. So you're not going to have adequate coverage for that part. Now, whenever you're dealing with a bigger part, and especially on bigger people where you may have a harder time telling exactly where their anatomy is, you can be centered too far to the sides of your detectors. And that's a very common thing, especially in like lumbar spine x-rays. So you want to make sure that you have the correct detector selected, the area over that detector, and then of course you want to have proper collimation. We learned about that with our scatter control, but also if you're dealing with, let's say you selected all 3 cells and you have collimation in tighter than the outer cells, that's going to throw off how well your AEC works. This picture just shows some of that. The image on the left, the chest x-ray, is a demonstration of what happens when you have center cells selected for a PA chest. You see we have adequate penetration and visualization of the structures right there in the center. So the AEC system did exactly what it was supposed to do. We just didn't select the right part. So it varied the time, because that's what AEC systems do, for the exposure. And it takes more time because it takes more x-rays to penetrate the middle part. So it kept on shooting. And then in the process, the outside got too much exposure. So that's what happened there. On the flip side, over here on the right, we have the example of a lateral lumbar spine where your detector and your part were not aligned. Lateral lumbar spines, especially when people have a lot of soft tissue, this is a very common mistake. You can see that basically the spinous process is over the detector instead of like the body. So think about the spinous process. It's not very thick. And well, of course, they've got a collimation error too. But in this case, instead of it being that the AEC system gave it too much time, the AEC system gave it too little time, because it said, oh, well, we've penetrated the spinous process. We're good. I'm done. I did what I was supposed to do. And it did, but things just weren't lined up correctly. So in that case, the image looks like it's underexposed. And this is similar to what would look like if you were to try to use your AEC system for like a clavicle exam or something to that effect. A quick note about your AEC and digital imaging. In digital, it may or may not look overexposed or underexposed like a film. Like it might not look black and white like those last pictures, but it will, if it's underexposed, it'll demonstrate quantum noise or quantum model because you just don't have enough photons. Or if it's overexposed, especially if it's a lot overexposed, you may see actual blacker part. But Miss Garner will talk to you about it in the summer with your digital imaging. You can get something called data drop, where the detector gets so over saturated that it just doesn't record data at all for that area. It's just black, and there's no shades of gray. There's no signal. There's no, you've just saturated it too much. So it may look a little different than the examples in your book. This is why it's always important to check those exposure index numbers and kind of use that as a, well, like a checks and balance system. You can check yourself before you wreck yourself. I couldn't resist. I'm sorry. You can check yourself before you make your next exposure. If you're doing your, like your lumbar spine, like I said, and you shoot it out, let's say you set that technique for that oblique lumbar spine that we talked about a while ago. You set 80 at 120, or I think I had 85 kVp earlier, 85 kVp at 120 MAS. And you check your exposure index and it says 1200 and your goal was to be 1500 because of the system you're working with. That means when you do your next oblique, you need to go up some more, or whatever the case may be. But use those because just looking at the image is not always going to tell you, because digital is made in such a way that it is going to try to make your image look correct even if the exposure was not. Okay, in case I have not stressed it enough yet, this is a reminder that everything that your AEC system does is based around varying your time. The AEC is never going to respond by changing the KVP. It is never going to respond by changing your MAS. It is only going to alter the time. Your time may be increased or decreased depending on what you've done. So in a case where you normally would say, oh, we need to increase the MAS or we need to increase the exposure for whatever reason, AEC is going to do that strictly by varying the time. If you're dealing with something that has, we'll talk in a few minutes about some patient considerations and how when you're dealing with patients who have certain pathological conditions, you may either need to increase or decrease your technique. If you are using AEC, it's just going to vary the time, just the time. If you have a person who has COPD, COPD is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Those people have trapped air in their lungs. It's a common misconception that people say, like, oh, they can't get enough air in. Well, they kind of can, but they kind of can't. They can't get enough air in because they've got trapped air that can't get back out. So their lungs are hyperinflated. So if they have more air in their lungs than what a normal person does, how do you think that's going to translate to a chest radiograph? You're not going to need as much technique because they have more air in there. So if you need not as much technique, your AEC system is going to respond by having a shorter exposure time. Conversely, if you're dealing with someone who has a hemothorax is a condition where usually it's something traumatic most of the time, but blood fills the pleural space. So they've got a big collection of blood in their chest compared to a normal chest x-ray. Those people are going to have a lot more density there, right? Because they've got more stuff than a normal chest and lung situation. And so the AEC would vary that by increasing the exposure time. KVP is set, your MA is set, just the time changes. So if it's something that you think you would need more technique, it's going to be more time. Less technique, less time. This is what would have happened in film screen. It says effect on film density. Read that as effect on IR exposure. If you were to adjust the goodness, sorry, I'm getting emails while I'm trying to record. This is pointless. Okay, nothing too important here. Let us move on. Okay, next section talks about anatomically programmed techniques. This is something that you guys are familiar with. You've either seen it at clinical or you have seen it in our lab. If you've done a couple of lab activities, you'll see that our techniques that we have set in the control panel at the college are not really very good. That's just how it came. And they asked us if we wanted to set better techniques, and we purposely didn't because we wanted you guys to see and to learn about setting your own techniques. It's kind of like how some of you who may have been at another clinical site shared with another school. I've heard students before say, well, such and such a school teaches them technique, but y'all don't teach us technique. This whole flipping class is teaching technique. We don't teach you ones to remember. We don't tell you to memorize them, and that if you use something that's 72 at 1 versus 70 at 1.25, that you're wrong. We think it's very important for you guys to learn how to make decisions about this on your own, not just memorize. So, like I said, our anatomically programmed techniques at the college are not very good ones, but that's by design. Like I said, you guys have seen these other places that you've been, but your anatomically programmed techniques allow you to select a part, your anatomy, and a technique automatically pops up. The portable machines, the GE portable machines that you guys see in a lot of places, are an example of that also. You can adjust them, but something comes up that gives you an idea based on the anatomy that you've selected. Some of these do have AEC along with them. So you might select a chest, and when you select the PA chest, it automatically selects the detectors that go along with that exam. If you're dealing with that kind of situation, it's important to pay attention to that because your detectors used may not be the same for each projection. Also, I have just realized how much I say the word on the flip side. On the flip side of that, a lot of times whenever I do stuff, like I'll do a PA chest and then I'll leave it on PA chest, but I'll change my detector selection and do the lateral. It still works. Now, you can't run a chest under a hand and vice versa, because Ms. Garner will talk to you about that in the summer, exactly what happens when you have the wrong body part altogether selected. But as long as you're in the right thing and you have the right detectors, you'll be all right. There are also technique charts that can be set. Everywhere is required to have exposure charts that tell you exactly what techniques will work for certain anatomies. These all basically hinge on you using proper measuring. You're going to have to use calipers to make sure that you're dealing with the correct thickness and be able to know the exact technique that goes along with that. So you have to be prepared to touch and measure everyone to use one of those. I think I used the example the other day in your chapter 6 lecture that, like, if you're doing a wrists don't vary that much in size. But whenever you talk about techniques for like lumbar spines, your lumbar spine technique could be anywhere from 5 or 6 MAS all the way up to a couple hundred MAS, because people's bodies vary so much. And remember your half value layer thing from the other day, well, and before, for every 5 centimeters thicker something is, you have to double your technique. So think about some of these people who have these big hanging bellies, how many times you have to double technique that you would start with for like an average size patient, just to accommodate all of that extra stuff, fluff and stuff. So your technique charts require that you measure the patient. They're basically based on an average patient size, and then you use your knowledge of your half value layer and know that for every 5 centimeters thicker, you have to double. For every 5 centimeters thinner, you have to half, and you go from there. You guys will develop an exposure technique chart for Mrs. Well, you might. You normally do in the summer as part of Mrs. Garner's digital class. You come up with your own technique chart based on exposures that you make of the full body phantom there. I don't know if y'all will be doing that this year. We'll see. I just realized that might not be happening. There are two types of technique charts. There are variable KVP / fixed MAS technique charts, or there are fixed KVP and variable MAS technique charts. I personally am a fan of a fixed KVP and variable MAS chart because that MAS math is so much easier than figuring out KVP math. But y'all do you. All right, in a variable KVP fixed MAS chart, it does just what it says. You measure the part and you change the KVP based on that part thickness. It says here, advantages: easy construction, simple to use. That's crap. I don't believe that for a hot minute. At low KVP levels, smaller changes are more effective. That's true. Remember, you have to change by about 15% to double your technique. So if you're working with 20 KVP, if you change to 23 KVP, you've changed 15%. Disadvantages: anatomic part penetration is not guaranteed. Remember, your KVP is your penetrating power of your beam. It sets the penetrating power of your beam. Changing the KVP is less effective for a range of procedures. Yeah, you got to change it a lot. Well, 15% for every 5 centimeters. So if you do a whole bunch of those, you're going to do a whole lot of changing. It's not very accurate for the very high and very low range of your measurements. Oh, I didn't mean to switch quite yet. I guess it don't matter. With that variable KVP fixed MAS chart, it would look something like you might use, oh, there is an example in the book. There's an example on page 226, table 8-3 has a variable KVP chart, and you can see that it is telling you for a knee, you're going to use 20 mass for every single knee you do, but you're going to change your KVP depending on the thickness. To me, that just seems hard. I don't know. Maybe I'm just stuck in my ways and old, which I'm really realizing with this switching to and instructing just how old and not tech savvy I am. But anyways, my personal favorite of the exposure technique charts is the fixed KVP variable MAS chart. You have a set KVP that you use for each part of the body, and then you just vary your MA based on the thickness. Part measurement's less critical because remember with MAS you have to have a change of 15% to make a difference in your exposure to your IR. With, I think I said that backwards and I'm not sure. Let me rephrase. Your KVP over change of at least 15% is required to change your exposure to your IR to either double it or half it. With MAS, it is either you're going to double or half your exposure to the IR when you double or half your technique. So if you're dealing with, like I said earlier, 80 MAS and you go to 85 MAS, it don't matter. Your measurement, if you're off, you are wrong by a couple centimeters, not a big deal. You have more wiggle room with your MAS than you do with your KVP. You also have an increased accuracy with a range of procedures, more consistent image contrast, and overall quality. That is based on the premise that changing your KVP is going to change your contrast. Remember, I told you your registry still says that, so we're still working off that. And then part penetration is assured. When you use the correct KVP setting, you are always going to get adequate penetration of your part. The disadvantage is that optimal KVP values are not standardized. I might use 85 kVp for just about everything in the bucky, and somebody else might use 70 kVp for almost everything in the bucky. And there's no like rules for or against either one. So that is an issue because, just like you guys have seen in clinical, you'll get techs who tell you that one thing will work and one tech will tell you that that thing wouldn't work at all, and you're just standing there bumfuzzled in the middle of two techs who don't agree on what to do. There's not any type of regulations on that because everybody uses different manufacturers, different vendors, all kinds of stuff. Different radiologists have different preferences about how they like their images to look, all kind of stuff. So there's not an agreed upon KVP value that you should be using in our field. But there are better decisions that can be made. Like we've talked about using a higher KVP and a lower MAS to save the patient some dose. On the flip side of that, with what we've learned about scatter control, if you get an all washed out looking image, then maybe that's not the best way to deal with a certain situation. Maybe if you've got somebody who's got an excess of adipose tissue, you want to use a lower KVP and increase that MAS. Yes, they get more dose, but they also get a diagnostic quality image, where an image that's covered in scatter and you can't make out any anatomic structures doesn't really do them any favors. So that's all I have to say about that. There are steps in here about how to develop your own technique chart. You guys can read that. I don't have much to say about it. I do think that when developing exposures, I think it's important. This is why we tell you guys to write down the techniques that get used for exams whenever you're at clinical. There is a theory of the concept of comparative anatomy that is important. I don't know if I've told y'all this story before. I'm going to tell it anyways. I think I told Hannah and Tyler one of the last times I was at CCH. But comparative anatomy is basically if you don't know a technique for one thing, but you know a technique for something that's similar, as long as it has a similar makeup, similar thickness, whatever, you can use that same technique and it'll be close enough. For example, let's say that you know that at a certain site they use 65 kVp at 10 MAS for knees in the bed. They're using a grid. They just do them all tabletop or in a stretcher, and that's what they use. And then all of a sudden you have a patient who comes in and they think she has a fractured shoulder, and you don't want to get her up and stand her at the bucket. You don't want to lay her on the hard board. So you're just going to get a grid and an image receptor and put it behind the shoulder, and you're going to x-ray it right there where it is. And then you think to yourself, I don't know what technique to set. Well, you can, instead of focusing on what you don't know, focus on what you do know. You do know that you've seen them shoot a crap ton of knees using this same technique, and it works on damn near everybody. Okay, take that and apply it to the situation. How thick is the knee? What's it made up of? Pretty close to shoulder material, right? Some people's shoulders are probably a little bit smaller than their knees. Some people's shoulders might be bigger than their knees. But roughly, you could use a shoulder technique and a knee technique are going to be very similar. So you could say, well, I think 66 or 65, whatever it was at 10, with this grid will work. Let's try that crap. And then you can go from there. You can always take one exposure. You look at your exposure index number, look at your image and make sure it doesn't have a bunch of quantum model or whatever on it, and go from there. All right, now my story about comparative anatomy, I'll give you the short version, is that when I was not long out of school, it was my work husband Jonathan and I were working at CCH on the weekend, and we got a call to go up and do a stat portable on a baby that had just been born and was up in the neonatal ICU at CCH, which has like 2 beds, but whatever, we have one. So we went up there and we were in the elevator. This is back in the days of film. We were in the elevator and we were trying to think. We were talking back and forth and we were like, I've never done one of these by myself. Crap, you've never done one by yourself either? What technique are we going to use? Oh, God. Okay. So we start thinking, and we think about comparative anatomy. And I had smaller legs then, and I was thinking about how big a fresh baby is around. And I started thinking, I bet that a fresh baby is about as big around as like my knee. And Jonathan and I, in our infinite wisdom, decided that we would use a knee technique to x ray this baby. And we thought we were so smart for figuring this out on our own. So we take the baby's x ray, go back downstairs, develop it. It starts to fall out of the processor, and it is just as black as it wants to be. And we were like, what the heck? How did we mess that up? They're about the same size. Well, my knee is full of what I like to think is just muscles, and femur, right? And what's a baby's just full of? Hopefully air and like nothing else. Our bones aren't even fully formed yet. So that's my story that goes along with comparative anatomy. Make sure that your anatomy is actually comparable, to another anatomical part. Don't compare your shoulder to, a baby's chest that has nothing in it, or my femur, which is full of femur and sex appeal. Just kidding. It's mostly just femur. So comparative anatomy. If you don't know something, compare it to something else. If you know an ankle technique, but you don't know an elbow technique, guess what, man? You do actually know an elbow technique, because your ankle technique will work also. Patient factors. Almost done. Whenever you're selecting technique, you need to make sure that you modify based on what is going on with your patient. We touched on this in chapter 6, talking about body habitus, and how that affects your technique. Of course, your part thickness affects how the beam is going to be attenuated, which in turn controls how much radiation is going to reach your IR, and your scatter and your contrast. Part thickness is a big deal. Pediatric patients may require a reduction in exposure because they don't have bones everywhere yet. Think about, you guys have just covered like skull and cranium and stuff with Mrs. Garner. Think about those baby skulls that have those huge fontanelles and just basically, God, that sounds terrible. I was going to say dead places, but it's not dead. But just places that don't have bone yet. Their bones are not as thick, and they have areas that they just don't have them. When you guys learned about wrists, babies are born without carpal bones. If any of you have done a bone age survey on a patient, it sounds like you're going to do some really in-depth stuff and like do something really cool, but you're just going to take an x-ray of their wrist, and the radiologist is going to count and measure their carpal bones to see how old they are. So when you're dealing with pediatric patients, you need to think about your technique. You're going to need to reduce your technique most of the time. And then also you may want to have higher MA and shorter times, because pediatric patients are not really known for being real still. Reduction in technique. Geriatric patients also may call for a reduction in technique because of different things that they have going on. You know, as you get older, you lose muscle mass in general, and you also start to lose some bone density. That's especially true with ladies. Guys can get it too, but osteoporosis becomes an issue. Bariatric patients, those are very obese patients who may require an increase in technique, but then you will also have to keep in mind that when you increase that KVP, what happens? You increase the scatter, because these people have a lot thicker tissue and things like that. So there's different things you may have to do for them. Different projections, positions, don't have anything to say that. Casts and splints. They're not as bad now, and I don't know how much you guys will get experience with this. We used to have an orthopedic site as a clinical site, and you may have to x-ray people through the cast, and that does require an increase in technical factors. The type of cast material also affects how much you may have to increase or decrease, increase your technique, or if it's still wet, because the water adds thickness, all of those things, but you might not ever have to deal with that in clinical. And then pathology, we talked about this. I touched on this a while ago with the COPD or a hemothorax. If you have an additive or destructive pathology, you're going to have to either increase or decrease your technical factors respectively for that. Soft tissue, contrast. Oh, this is a good one. You guys just talked about these. When you're dealing with positive contrast agents are those things that are going to show up white on a regular x-ray, barium and iodine. You do need to increase your technique for that. When you are dealing with a iodinated contrast, you'll want to use a little bit higher kVp, but nothing too crazy. So you can use a little bit more than maybe you would use for an abdomen. 80 or 90 kVp would be sufficient when you're dealing with iodinated contrast. But when you're dealing with barium, you need to use a very high kVp, because remember, your barium has a high atomic number, and otherwise you are not going to be able to penetrate their belly if you don't have enough kVp. I like to give y'all examples of ways to apply this information. When I do small bowel films, my technique that I start with for a patient, so let me preface this by saying, when I work at CCH, I am working nights or weekends. We don't have transport. We don't have anyone there. There's usually only 2 techs, and that's it. So if we get an order for like a small bowel follow through, you know how you guys might, if you're at Moore or somewhere, they bring the patient every 30 minutes to you or every hour to you. We don't have that there. So what we do is we go up and do them portably. We go up every 30 minutes to an hour and do the exam in their room with the portable machine and come back down. So where I'm going with that, what technique am I going to be using whenever I'm doing a small bowel follow through? My starting technique for a small bowel follow through is about 110 kVp at 4 MAS. Yes, only 4 MAS. If you start with 80 kVp at 32 MAS and you 15% and 50% that thing until you get to about 110 kVp, you'll get down to 4 MAS. It's the same technique. It's just a different way to do it. When you're dealing with contrast, when you're dealing with barium as your contrast material, you need to be using a very high kVp, 110, 120, something like that. Did I cover everything? I feel suspicious that I have forgotten something just because. Probably so, but it's okay. All right. I am going to do the same thing that I did for y'all in the last lecture. I read the objectives, so I'm going to let you reread. These are just the objectives. At this point, you should be able to eyeball them and see, okay, do I know the purpose of AEC and radiography? Yes, I want to standardize radiation dose and make sure my images all look the same, so I want to get the same radiation exposure. Cool, got it. Go through these review slides and make sure that you know the material on them. If you know the review slides, then you know the material. If you know the material, then you can just earn yourself 100 on this next exam, which will be on the 22nd of April for any of you who missed the interactive thing this morning. I don't really remember who all was there. Well, I can remember people I saw, but I don't remember who wasn't there. Let me say that. So that's that. Hopefully this is helpful. If you guys have questions, comments, or concerns about your exposure technique selection chapter, I hope you will reach out and let me know. And I will talk to you again soon.